I'm going to introduce the final panel in today's program, in which we're going to look at assessment and accountability. As we heard earlier, coming to an agreement that fairly balances our competing civic priorities and then finding a way to fund our assets is a real challenge. But even when a project is finally done, our work is not complete. The assumptions, mitigation measures, and promises laid out during the planning stages require follow-up and follow-through. This panel will examine whether existing evaluation procedures are enough. Looking to the rezoning of 125th Street in Harlem as an example, to what extent were the outcomes of this process analyzed? Were promises upheld and assets delivered? In the case of Williamsburg Greenpoint rezoning, we know that this was not the case. The community awaits a 28-acre park promised in exchange for the residential rezoning of the waterfront in 2005. A decade later, this vital asset remains unrealized, and the trust between the city and its citizens has eroded. So how do we ensure accountability? To be effective advocates for our assets, we must critically examine these processes intended to uphold and promote the public interest. I want to invite our panel to discuss these challenges from a variety of perspectives. Please welcome our moderator, Alyssa Katz, editorial writer for the New York Daily News, and our panelists to the stage.
Okay, great. Good afternoon. As Gina said, I'm Alyssa Katz. I'm on the editorial board of the Daily News, where I write a lot about planning and development. With me here today, we have Stephen Kass, Senior Environmental Counsel at Carter, Ledyard, and Milburn. Barbara Askins, President and CEO of the 125th Street Business Improvement District. Councilman Stephen Levin, representing Brooklyn Heights, Dumbo, Williamsburg, Greenpoint, Boerum Hill, Vinegar Hill, downtown Brooklyn, and Bedford-Stuyvesant, and Eve Barron, Chair of the Graduate Center for Planning and the Environment at the Pratt Institute. We're here today to talk about, as Gina said, really accountability for the stewardship of public assets, and in particular, how to ensure, after all of the extensive environmental and land use reviews that go into conceiving and delineating public projects and the use and care of public assets, how to ensure that that responsible parties actually deliver on those commitments. So I wanted to start by asking about these blunt tools that go into the planning and shaping of the cityscape. We have the Uniform Land Use Review Procedure. We have SECRA and SECRA, the environmental reviews. They each have certain elements that can be useful in ensuring desired results over the long term and not just reaching a deal in the immediate. And they also have kind of glaring deficiencies that I think all of the panelists have encountered firsthand, and I'm sure many of you have as well. So I want to just take stock, first of all, about kind of just big picture strengths and weaknesses. I would say of both of those tools, but let's start out with the environmental reviews, which I know you have expertise on, and sort of, what is it that community stewards and stakeholders can really learn and understand about those environmental tools and how they can really be used to ensure results? And what are the assets and what are the weaknesses of those tools?
Well, I'm a fan of SECRA. I believe the Environmental Impact Statement, EIS, is a terrific tool. It's a great invention. It's one of the, along with jazz and baseball, I think it's what America has given the world. And it has encouraged public participation in a direct way, way beyond what EULA ever did, or the planning process pre-SECRA. And it does require consideration of alternatives and findings as to impacts and likely benefits and costs of a project. Its great omission, the real failure for SECRA at the city level the state level and even at the federal level, NEPA, on which they're both based, is that it is a snapshot in time and it does not continue on after action is taken. It is intended to require informed decision-making, but not informed conduct after that in an accountable way. So I think that we have to improve seeker, and I think it can be done in several ways. The World Bank, which picked up our ideas of an environmental impact statement, created something called an assessment panel to which dissatisfied constituents could come and complain about the carrying out of mitigation for World Bank projects. I see no reason why the city could not create, within the context of its own administrative review, a review panel to which citizens could bring their concerns about mitigation and the performance of whether Parks did it or DOT did it or any other agency carried out what it was supposed to do, or whether a developer carried out its commitments. And while you could not force action, I'm not prepared to say we should make that enforceable on the part of third parties, but it could bring real spotlight on the failure of a city agency or a private developer, talking about public-private developments a while ago, to carry out contemplated mitigation. And then you could simply look at how it's working. People may have tried, but it's not having the effect that was intended. So I think that is an important improvement that the seeker process could create administratively in the city.
Okay, and I want to get back to seeker in a minute, but I also want to, Barbara, I want to throw you the same question about EULA. And, you know, in particular, the experience with the 125th Street rezoning. So maybe you could fill people in a little bit about that, you know, what happened there and, you know, the strengths and weaknesses of the process there.
Thank you. Well, I think first thing, the EULA process is a great process because it engaged and bring all the community together. And I don't know of any process right now that bring all those ideas together and put you in a room to examine a specific area that the city is zooming in on. But I think one of the, up front, the community doesn't know that the EULA is coming. And when the city comes, they're already armed, prepared, have looked at it in many different ways, many different angles. And so the community at the initial point of hearing about it is running behind a train. There's like what we say on the local level, there's an agenda here, and you find yourself in a position of trying to educate the community, educate the city in terms of what you have presented to us is not what's really happening here. More inclusion into the decision makers that are driving the project. And lastly, being able to present your argument in a way that is compelling enough to get the city's attention. That's the drawback I find. For us on 125th Street, luckily enough, we were already in the process of organizing our stakeholders, the property owners, to come together and examine what 125th Street was about. So we had looked at transportation, we had looked at design, build, we had looked at all of those things and had come to the conclusion that culture was the major theme that was permeating out of every conversation. So we were able to respond. We were able to respond in a way that basically educated not only the city, but as well as the community, and was able to galvanize and get the community to come behind us. I would hate to think of what would have happened if we had not been in that position, because we were the only ones in that position in the community, and we were pitted against housing and culture, And so the agenda, this is another downfall that I find, the agenda pit community segments against each other and fighting against each other in the process. And whoever is more politically astute at working through the system get their argument on the table. That's the major drawback I see.
And in the case of 125th Street, I mean, the result of the EULA was, you know, in theory, you know, the cultural district was part of that agreement, but it seems like it didn't necessarily work. Just because it was in the EULA didn't mean that you actually got the result desired. So where did that gap emerge in that case? Why was it that the plan said this is going to be a cultural district, and then, it didn't come to fruition in quite that way?
Okay, our proposal was for a cultural district from river to river. It was a river to river project. Okay, so we felt that if there was cultural uses from river to river, that would create cultural industries that would then jumpstart the economy and help small businesses to be a part of the project. What we ended up with the EULA was a cultural district in the core center, the area that really needed the less, where all of the arts and culture should be there. That's one thing. The second part was we presented cultural production as well as presentation, which would allow for small clusters of studios, dance, and the city's project was more performance and large scale. And so then the third part was the cultural bonus, which would allow the property owners to get additional density if they did free space for cultural uses. And so property owners were willing to do that, but then in the negotiations, there were determinations of where that space should be located and what size and who would say would get it. So on the private side, developers have not chosen to use the cultural bonus. The positive is city projects are keeping that as a goal, and so we are still looking to do that, but we're still looking for that private project.
Yeah, so there's sort of a theme emerging here, right? Where you have, with ULURP, you have certain commitments that exist in the zoning, but
Yes.
don't come into fruition because the incentives maybe aren't properly aligned. With SECRA, one thing I think we'll talk about a bit on this panel is about, there are certain assumptions that get really spelled out in the environmental review about impacts and so on, and whether or not they're actually borne out doesn't necessarily get scrutiny. Just to bring other panelists into this, I think another variation on the theme is with zoning, and I think this is something that Councilman Levin has dealt with, is that you have not only the ULURP itself, but then certain side negotiations to that land use agreement that also require oversight and enforcement without the sort of legal power of the zoning. And I think you've dealt with that in Greenpoint and Williamsburg. So why don't you tell us about that and how that works and doesn't work as well?
Absolutely. At this point, I've been in the council for 7 years, and just in the time that I've been there, I've had probably 8 or 9 larger ULURP actions. It's basically like 6 and 9 large ULURP actions. And I'm now of the mind that I don't want to see any more side agreements of any kind with anything that I do, because the level of frustration. I mean, there ends up being no accountability, and because it's a blunt tool. Both Seeker and ULURP are blunt tools. They don't catch everything, and they're not. They can't be as creative as things we can conjure up, and so they don't address all the issues that end up coming up throughout the process. I mean, one thing about ULURP that I'm very keenly aware of now, it's a very political process.
Yes. Exactly.
It's spelled out in it's got its legal obligations along the way. Its relationship when it comes to the community boards, when it comes to the borough presidents, when it comes to the city planning commission, and when it comes to the council, at each step along the way represents kind of a different political shade, and so it ends up being shaped by a lot of concerns that are outside of the application itself, and so what oftentimes ends up happening are commitments are made either by a developer or by the city that don't have good enforcement. So, I could give 2 examples. In my second rezoning was Domino Sugar in 2010. So there were 2 Domino Sugar rezonings. One was CPC rezoning, and the other one was 2 Trees. And there was the first one, there was a requirement under 421A to do 20% affordable housing. And they said that they were going to do 30% affordable housing. They're going above and beyond what the rest of their legal obligations were. And they ended up selling the project. And the very first phone call that I got from the entity that purchased the development site was, we're not going to abide by that commitment. It was written, it was a unofficial commitment. It was not legally binding in any way. And that was, while disappointing, I couldn't, there wasn't much I could say to that. It was, they were right. They weren't legally required to do that. We got to engage with them then as they progressed through they ended up doing another EULA application for a different configuration of the project. Another example is in 2005, there was a points of agreement so the two big things were Greenpoint rezoning. There was a separate thing that's called the points of agreement between the administration and the community. And there they promised an extra park in the northern end of Greenpoint through some air rights transfer off of an MTA leased property. And when I came into office, it had been that point of agreement, that one had not moved for 6 years at that point, or 5 years. And so it took a lot of work to kind of get back and re-engage that process, but without any real legal leg to stand on. And so it's just, that's a huge frustration. And it's something that's not covered by seeker or EULA.
Right. I mean, and Eve, there's a component of this, right? So we're talking about how these legal and semi-legal tools, right, can be brought to bear. There's also the sort of human leverage here, right? And how do you see the community planning process kind of beginning to fill some of these holes? I mean, we'll continue to talk about how deep these holes get.
Sure. I mean, just to comment and add on what some of the other panelists are saying about EULA and EIS or SECRA, I think that part of the problem stems from the fact that there is no one single overarching entity that's really monitoring, all the deals that and the side agreements and the commitments and the mitigations that have been promised that are actually predicating city council's approvals. So, it happens in a very piecemeal fashion that Department of City Planning is responsible for one thing, HPD is responsible for another, DEP is responsible for another, and there's no single entity monitoring that and ensuring that those commitments are moving, or, that they have capital dollars attached to them, or operating, budget attached to them. Another problem with EIS and EULA is the fact that the community comes in at such a late stage. By the time you even get to pre-scoping or pre-certification, the Department of City Planning and other agencies have already met with the applicant, whether it's private or public. They've already shaped the project. They've already determined the parameters. In some cases, they've already determined if there's an environmental assessment or EIS required. And the community hasn't even entered into the conversation, or not even, the council member in most regards. So I think it's a somewhat of a rigged game, from the beginning. And, at risk of typecasting, I think that while we have these problems with EULA and EIS, what we really have is a planning process problem, and that what's needed is genuine, well-resourced community-based planning that can become the building blocks for what happens, and that so anytime there is a project proposed, it can be assessed against and reconciled with a community plan. And I also think on the other side of the planning, you need bottom-up planning, but you also need top-down planning. So we have a real need for comprehensive citywide planning frameworks, that go beyond just zoning. I mean, for a very long time, New York City has claimed it has a citywide plan, but it has a zoning resolution, which is not a citywide plan. And zoning leaves out all kinds of things mentioned by, my fellow panelists here that come up through the EULA process. And without any ability to address those things through zoning, they get relegated to EIS and to EULA. And that makes planning happen in a very fragmented process.
I wonder if I can comment on this. I think, if I may,
Yeah.
the question of enforceability of commitments made during the EIS process actually can be solved by simply having a restrictive declaration on the part of an applicant or a city agency that in fact requires it to do what needs to be done. Now, that doesn't mean there's a third party that can enforce it so easily. That's a different issue, and we can talk about that. But there's no reason why a restrictive declaration can't commit an applicant to provide X number of units that are affordable or to build the park, and indeed to set forth a time schedule that those units or that park has to proceed the next part. That's actually what, if you look at the Western Rail Yards EIS, which was a very complicated EIS, it did include commitments along those lines. I thought that was appropriate. I also think, with respect to Eve's comment, which I agree with your planning comments, but there is a small problem in the way that Seeker and EULA have been integrated, which means that there is a very short time under law between a DEIS hearing under Seeker and the end of the 90-day EULA period where the City Planning Commission has to act. And that means that as a practical matter, it is very difficult for the city or an applicant or its consultants to take into account all those public comments and look at the new alternative that you've suggested in the hearing and recast it and balance it. I actually think it would be better if the City Planning Commission had the right to extend its 60-day review period by another 30 or even 60 days so that it could take into account those ideas and reflect them in a final EIS. And while developers might think that that will slow it down, I think it would not, because in fact it could introduce some flexibility into the pre-certification process. Right now you have to answer every question during pre-certification, and that's the lock-in. And if you had more flexibility at the end, you could have a little more flexibility in the beginning to respond to the concerns that you're talking about.
A question I actually wanted to throw you is, on another panel I moderated recently, Purnima Kapoor from Department of City Planning, she was talking about EISs and specifically projections around things like secondary residential displacement, which is a big issue in Williamsburg-Greenpoint. And in fact, I forget the exact numbers in Williamsburg-Greenpoint, but the projections were a very small number. It was something like 2,000 displaced households. And clearly it was far, far more than that in the end. And yet there was no accountability around this. And when someone from the audience asked Ms. Kapoor about this, she said, well, the EIS is really a statement of intent. It's not, not really something, in a sense, she was saying it wasn't something that they had to actually live up to in consequence. And I wanted to just sort of get a reality check from you as an attorney. Is the EIS merely a statement of intent, or is there actually some legal enforceability there that a community can actually act on when the results are so different from the projections in the EIS?
It's more than a statement of intent. It's an statement that has to measure up against legal standards in terms of accuracy and reasonableness. And a lot of projects have been stopped because the EIS missed that. The problem is post-approval, and the EIS doesn't really address remedies post-approval. In that sense, people can say, well, we changed our mind, or we couldn't do it, or we didn't get the budget allocation or something. And there, I think, there is a gap, and that's the reason why I suggested perhaps a citywide performance review panel would be appropriate to be created by the mayor, actually, so that people could say that park is not being built on time, or it's not an active recreation park, and it's just being passive, or whatever it is. And that might not be legally enforceable, but I think it would provide real sunlight on an issue and require a city agency to explain why it's not complying with what it had promised.
Right. And I think similarly in thinking about reforms potentially, or ways to do things better on ULURP, and this is for both you, Barbara, and Stephen, I mean, both the rezonings that you're kind of reckoning with now, we're in the mid-2000s, they were Bloomberg era rezonings. A decade later, if you had to do those over again, how would you do them differently? And I know you're saying you wouldn't want to do an points of agreement again, but I think there's some legal constraints on what you can do through zoning. So if you're not doing it, those changes through zoning, how do you get the results that you want to get in both of these instances?
Well, I mean, it's a little bit different when you're dealing with the city as an applicant versus a private developer, and I think that actually, I mean, I do look at those differently, because I do believe that if the city makes a commitment, I have to take them at their word. Sometimes they don't come through. You know, as we could see with this, the Williamsburg Greenpoint, this issue of the park, the Bushwick Inlet Park, where here we are 12 years later, they haven't acquired all of it. If I could go back in time and do it differently, you know, they should have probably acquired it at the time. The cost of, I mean, it's been in the paper, the cost of acquisition for these parcels has been extraordinary. But if you go back and look at the final report from the department, or from City Planning Commission, it says the number in the first sentence, this rezoning is going to create a 28-acre park. It is not an afterthought. It is the purpose of it. It is the public benefit, and they really kind of it's frustrating because honestly, I've spent the last couple of years trying to address that. But I think that they should have done that on the front end. At the same time, contemporaneous or right before that was the downtown Brooklyn rezoning, and the thing they missed in that one, they never built a school. There's no elementary school in downtown Brooklyn now. And they predicted about 1 million square feet of residential. They got 10 million square feet of residential. No elementary school. So, you know, it's looking at what are these worst case scenario impacts and trying to plan ahead and think through it a little bit, and taking making some of the hard decisions up front and taking on the costs up front. I mean, that's it. It's just taking on the costs up front and being honest and being fully honest with the costs, particularly on a city initiated rezoning, and not kicking the can down the road because it's going to be more expensive to deal with.
And that's partly on the council, right? I mean, I think that's, you know, the council wants to reach a deal, but the council has to budget for these, you know, the amenities of schools and so forth. So how do you get the council politically to own that long term?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing, honestly, going through like 8 of these is that I try to now look ahead a little bit and try to address some of these issues on the front end, instead of you know, taking their word for it that they'll address it on the back end.
Mm-hmm.
So what I would say is that the community needs more empowerment in these rezonings. We, 125th Street Bid, represent the stakeholders, and how we heard about the rezoning just walking through the streets. And literally, so when we contacted the city, the response was, well, you're one of the groups that we're going to be reaching out to. So, you know, this is literally what we heard. So again, what we decided, okay, this is a battle. So let's pick what the battle is going to be, and we have to be smart about it. But then what I'm saying, what I think needs to happen, the worst thing that happened then is the city is driving the organizing of the community. And so when we look at, they're the ones calling all the meeting and writing all the minutes and the notes and putting it up on their website of saying, we had this community meeting and this is what the community said. So you're in a part of, no, that's not what I said, and trying to get it out. Oh, if you make enough noise, they'll strike out 2 sentences, but then still leave it there. So you're just twirling around in it. So I think the whole community involvement process should have, the community needs to have more empowerment in this, because the city literally don't know the community stakeholders. They may know a few. When you go to the meeting to sit down to talk to them, there's no one there sitting across that dais that you identify with or know. So you find yourself educating them about your community and they already have an agenda, so they're really not listening to you. So I feel that the community, maybe the council can find the way that there's more empowerment of the community in terms of giving the input back to the city.
And then the question becomes, because, you know, we've described all these scenarios, general and specific, in which you have either certain commitments or promises or intentions or politically expedient gestures all kind of in the mix, and then you're left with not having a park, not having the cultural resources, and then the question becomes, what can you do? What is your recourse? And I don't know if anyone here has actually tried to sort of pursue a specific path in any of these. I know you're raising the issue of the park. I don't know if you attempted to get a fix on the zoning, but what are the options here, and what doors have you found to be closed?
Well, we did try to get one fix. Through the rezoning, the thing that was left out is the facades of the development projects. And so with the property owners, paid for a study to look at bringing in LED technology to the facades of buildings around cultural use and generating revenue to just give to small businesses so that they could, have a chance to compete in an environment that was growing. And we had to go back, we were looking for a zoning text amendment. They give you these zoning text amendment changes that you can do, but you still have to go through city planning. City planning have to determine whether or not they're gonna move it forward or take it back to EULA. And so city planning killed it and said, no, that wasn't for 125th Street, and we're just stuck. We haven't been able to move it any further. There's nowhere for us to go.
So this is maybe a question for Councilmember Levin, not to put you on the spot or anything, but does council have the ability in its approval-making capacity to do clawbacks, or to deny certificate of occupancy, or, stop a building permit if a developer or a city agency applicant isn't living up to the promises made during the land use review process?
So I've explored various options, restrictive decks on rezonings, and we did a rezoning recently, where it was a disposition of city-owned land for Brooklyn Public Library. I think I saw him here earlier, but David Kramer was the developer there, and we actually worked in language into the contract of sale of the city-owned land between the library, the city EDC, and Hudson, where if some of the agreements weren't met, then there would be an enforcement tool within the contract itself, and so we used the contract as the clawback mechanism, essentially.
I see no reason why you cannot, either in the contract or preferably in the approval resolution of city planning, build in a requirement for restrictive declaration. You can build in requirements for escrow funds. If you're going to build a park or build a school, put up the money. You can talk about timing. You can say, until the school is up, you can't build more than X units. I mean, there's no reason why those things can't be built in. And there is a question as to enforceability, because typically enforceability would be within the city agency, not necessarily within the library or the Board of Education, or certainly not within a community group. And there's some tricky issues to be dealt with there, which is why I thought that in addition to those provisions, you could have an inspection panel or a review panel so that sunlight could be brought by citizens, and thus, at some point, the mayor will have to pay attention to why those commitments are not being enforced.
I mean, one thing is that the council in some ways plays that role now. I mean, we're the sounding board for people saying, hey, where's our park?
Right.
But it would be good to have an alternative agency for that as well.
Particularly with term limits and people are gone.
Right, absolutely. I mean, there's institutional memory is a big concern. Absolutely.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about that. Kind of, what part of the problem I think we've raised a number of times here on this panel is the lack of accountability, lack of any one agency or individual to actually go to and say, hey, what about this thing? So in your ideal world, what might that accountability institution look like? Is it the Department of City Planning? Is it someone or something else?
Well, just as a kind of a parallel, every year the city produces something called the Fair Share Report, and it spells out what each city agency has determined to be its needs for land use siting for that year, and it is a sunlight tool that is meant to that's been created to allow interested engaged parties to review exactly what the city has planned. So I feel that, there's a need for something similar to be published on a yearly basis about the commitments that public and private applicants have made through land use actions that would maybe be the basis for your independent review board, but it would allow, average residents and citizens to monitor things across time. Because right now the record is so fragmented. You have to spend hours and hours looking at the Department of City Planning's website to find a ULIP report, much less, like the MOU that went along with our ULIP report. So I think, at least putting these things into a very public, very common, very accessible report that can be monitored on a regular basis might begin to address this.
And may I say that it's not just bad faith. Sometimes the best ideas turn out to be wrong. And that maybe this park is not serving the purpose in the community that we had in mind. Maybe it has to be redesigned. Let's think about that. So it's not just to catch people doing their job poorly, or not doing it. It's really to reflect more wisdom and more experience with what happens.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on this yearly report. I think that we're in a data-driven era, and so looking at the correct data points that we want to collect around rezoning and having that annual report come out every year and published so that everybody can see. I get the question all the time, even for this panel, how many projects really happen on 125th Street after the rezoning? And you have to go through the map and look and count and try to figure it out. How many of these things that we say were going to happen didn't happen, and what were the reasons for it not happening? And most of the agencies, like for us, business improvement districts, we have to do it every year. We have to submit an annual report to the Department of Small Business Services, and they analyze and look, and when the numbers shift crazy, we have to give an explanation. Why isn't that happening with rezoning?
I think, to their credit, the de Blasio administration has accepted generally the principle that a commitment made by one administration is an obligation of the next. It's not codified in any way, and so I think that I would be interested in seeing ways in which particularly on a city-driven rezoning, that you can actually put down markers, say this has lay down chronology. That has to happen before X has to happen before Y can happen. The park has to be acquired and built before the 6,001 or first unit gets built, right? Laying out that chronology, I think, would be but it has to be done again on the front end.
That's right, and it has to be done in a way that to the extent private parties are involved, that they are, as you're saying, with restrictive declarations and so on, that they in fact have to abide by those.
I think in the currently pending Greater East Midtown zoning, there is a list of transit improvements, and the for which you can get extra FAR in a commercial area. And the developers have to go through those commitments to make the transit improvements before they're allowed to get the additional FAR through a different kind of bonus from transfer of development rights, for example. I think that's appropriate and could be teased out a little more.
So we have some very good questions coming in from you folks and folks out there. So I will start asking them and maybe throw in some of my own. ULURP, SEQRA, EIS creates a system of checks and balances. However, outreach to communities is virtually non-existent. It seems like projects exist, like the process exists, only to check a box. How can we encourage awareness and participation, especially for communities of color, to have their voices heard?
A good example of how I think it's being done right now is Councilmember Lander, my neighbor, and with Pratt have done this Bridging Gowanus experience, process, pre-ULURP, which brought together communities to start talking about and laying out what their priorities are, a series of charrettes, not just a one-off, but a series of a couple, 10 or so meetings, community-based meetings. that's a good way of, but it requires a lot of initiative on the front end and a partner that has the wherewithal to do the legwork. So.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that the community need to understand that when rezoning come in, they need to use the community resources like a Pratt. And I talk about our report that we did, but we were able to do that because of Columbia University. When this happens, the community can't do it by themselves. You need to immediately start seeking your resources that exist there and engage them in the process right away, and even to the point of looking for grants. The universities are good at being able to do that. We also had a planning grant from the federal government as well as from the Rockefeller Foundation. Otherwise, we would, because we generated reports to respond to the city in less than a month. And it is very difficult to do that on your own without having those partnerships.
If you want to build a transmission line in New York State, you have to apply to the Public Service Commission for a permit. And that application requires you, as an applicant, to put up a certain amount of money. It used to be $50,000, I think it's more than that now, as a public participation consultation fund, permitting affected communities to go out and hire consultants to do exactly what you're saying.
Yes.
And it would not be crazy to be thinking about some version of that here.
State DEC does it on their super funds.
Yes.
So I think just an interesting analogy is to participatory budgeting, where people have a direct stake in, in what happens after a result of their participation. And, participatory budgeting has happened pretty effectively in some districts because of the participation of CBOs who, do real grassroots organizing and really get to people who ordinarily aren't participating in the public review process. But I think that the reason that they are willing to participate is because, what they're voting on actually has a direct impact, So I think part of it is, what has been suggested here, but part of it is really rebuilding the public trust, with community residents, that if they are going to participate, it's not going to just be seen as checking off the box, that there's going to be some real outcome to it.
And not just not checking off a box, but I mean, I think Bushwick and Light Park, I know there's so many other examples, and but it's such a good one to reference again, where people say, well, that didn't happen. I participated because there wasn't participation in the classic sense in Williamsburg Greenpoint, but there was some level of responsiveness to the community saying, we need something out of this, and negotiations and discussions, and then no results. So I feel like people, and I think 125th Street is probably similar, people feel like they have been burned. They feel like they put in all these hours, they spent nights away from their families, went to meetings, and for what? So, I don't know, that we just have to have more faith in the system and these accountability mechanisms to do it right. But how do you convince people up front that it is worth their time to go and do these things?
In a couple of cases.
We have to look at we had the rezoning at 125th Street, then we had the Columbia University rezoning, then you have to rezone the east side, and we're all one community, so we're running from meeting to meeting. We were not going home at night at all. Every night, we're in a meeting running from place to place. It had gotten to the point where the protesters from all three communities started coming together because we just couldn't figure it out. That's just too much at one time for one community to throw all that rezoning. And then one thing that we find is just the timing of the last public hearing is always an inconvenient time. The timing of ours was like in the summer months. In the summer months, it's like as much as the community can do, we're fighting against this whole system that's really not working in your favor.
Right, and I will say, one thing that has happened recently is that in Williamsburg, at the site of the Pfizer, former Pfizer factory, which is now a prospective housing site, you have community organizations that have shut one city planning hearing down. I don't know what happened with the second. Is that in your district?
It is in my district.
Well, what do you think of that particular strategy?
That was for like a pre-certification scoping meeting. You know, I don't think that that's the right strategy, just because it's, you know, that's basically saying that, you know, we're going to shout down the democratic process, or the actual sanctioned process. And so, you know, I don't think that that's the right. You can't just shut it down. If you want to improve the system, if you want to improve a project, you know, get to work and deal with some of the hard questions. But that's not. It's not as easy as just like literally shutting down meeting after meeting, and it's not sustainable. Like, at what point? What's the ultimate end game there? You can't just shut down every meeting. You know, I'm not really in favor of that tactic. Although I understand where they're coming from. Sure.
Another question from the audience. Is New York City in danger of becoming uncompetitive in attracting and retaining businesses and their employees if our approvals process becomes too onerous?
I don't think at some point, I suppose that's true. But at the moment, I don't notice that. I must say, New York City does not seem to be suffering from a lack of demand for its real estate. There are times when the EULA process or the seeker process is amazingly frustrating and onerous for applicants, including the city, even when it wants to do something. And there are ways in which I believe it should be streamlined and made better for everybody. But that's really another day session.
And how about for the bid members? I mean, is there any part? I know they're mostly renting property, right? But are they affected by
This approval process?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's just too convoluted. It's not user-friendly for the developer. It's either hire somebody to sort through it and figure it out, or they call us, which we're doing right now, reading through it and trying to write it in a way where it's easier for them to obtain the information. I think that's one of the problems with the rezoning. The other thing is it just, after it's finished, it's just that old information that's there. You don't get any new updates, and it's real hard to find the changes that's being made. It's just not user-friendly.
This weekend I went down to Washington, D.C., and like in Washington, there's not like a building over 60 feet or something like that.
Right.
You know, so Crimea River, you know.
right?
Well, that's because of the rule they have about the Washington Monument.
The dense.
But I mean, it's that's a low-rise city. People are still building there. You know?
Yep. And this is actually a question, I think, for you, Councilman, and for others. Can you speak to the influence of lobbyists in discretionary actions by the city? How can we ensure a level playing field between the public and applicants?
That is a really good question, because there's a handful of firms that represent applicants, and they come before us over and over again, and it's something that as a member of the council, you do have to kind of keep in check, because you develop professional relationships talking with these people, and you know, multiple times on different projects, but regardless of either your affinity or unaffinity for the lobbyist, I think it's important to kind of keep that professional distance. But it's always something that you have to remind yourself of, for sure.
I think the public just has to be alert and through community groups and get in there. And I'm involved in some such fights right now. It's one of the reasons I think that community groups need resources, because they can get in and they can't counter everything, but they can have their voice heard to try and slow down the influence of the lobbying community. I think it's a legitimate and important question.
Okay. Another question from the audience. The rest of the country and even the world looks to New York City as a model. Speaking of accountability, how can we provide a good example of process? We've heard a couple of good examples, but I'm sure there are many more. Where have we seen accountability work from the grassroots, from other sources here in New York City?
I mean, we have had examples of successful community-based plans in New York. You know, some are historic, like, you know, the plan for Cooper Square, that resulted in overturning an urban renewal project imposed by Robert Moses and resulted in a housing plan with zero displacement. That's an example. A more recent one is the plan for Melrose Commons, which was another, alternative plan to a proposed urban renewal plan for the South Bronx, which would have reduced the residential and commercial density to levels, pre-World War II, and the neighborhood was interested in really revitalizing at a much higher density because the infrastructure was there. So, there was a community-based organization called Nos Quedamos We Stay that rallied and opposed the city's urban renewal plan, got together with neighbors, and had a history, of providing for each other, providing essential city services for each other when the city had gone through a process of planned shrinkage. So, they had a tradition of organized to come up with an alternative plan, and then became a community development corporation to build out that alternative plan. So, I think that to the extent that we can reproduce some of those models and actually enfranchise them into the city's planning process and make sure that community plans have traction in the city's planning process, then I think we could be a model for accountability.
Let me add that I think despite its limitations, the EIS process actually has been emulated in about 100 countries around the world, and it's a start. The other ways in which New York City has a wonderful model is transit and water supply. I mean, those are the things that make our city possible, and other communities need to do that. And finally, I think the Bloomberg administration should get some credit for trying to plan for resiliency in the face of climate change.
I'd just like to add, one of the things the city planning kept saying during the rezoning is that they knew it was not addressing all of the issues, but it was a framework, creating a framework where there was no framework. We didn't have one, and that is true. We do have a framework, and we have something to build from, and it's not the best, but it's not the worst either. I don't want it to seem like, everything the city did wrong, because that's not true. We do have a framework, and we do can go back and at least address some of the things where before it was everything was being done by variances, with the project. So we now are more organized and more structured.
I did want to just point out one basic failure of Seeker in New York City, and that is the way that we calculate secondary displacement. Because I think the assumptions that underpin the environmental impact statement process are based on this idea that only legal mechanisms are going to be used to kick people out of their homes, and that we aren't going to have any loss of rent-stabilized buildings during a rezoning. So you pointed out, I think you started this conversation pointing out the very slight figures about displacement in East New York. So that part of that is a result of how we calculate secondary displacement, and we need to revisit that in the EIS. It's critical to really reflect contemporary gentrification and displacement.
I agree with that.
I'd just like to, I have a question, I guess. When buildings are identified as potential development sites in the rezoning, and the rationale and the reasons that they determined that these are development sites and would cause displacement, that's where I got lost. I didn't really understand how all that was taking place, and it moved so fast, so we just accepted those blocks as development sites. But how that decision was made was, I just didn't understand that, and most of us in the community didn't understand that.
That's a complicated process that the Department of City Planning works on. I happen to be fighting with them about that on that very issue now. But there are people who try to make professional judgments as to when a development site will be developed and at what approximate density. And sometimes they're right and sometimes they're wrong. It is very technical. You're right to focus on it.
We have time for one more question, and that is, and building off of the last one, how can ULURP and Seeker become less blunt? I think we called it a blunt tool earlier, and how can it kind of encompass, how can they encompass more? I mean, clearly this involves the city charter, it involves state and city law. But what are the outlines of, you could rewrite those, how would they look different?
You're looking at me?
I'll look at you.
I will tick off the things I've said and then learn from others. I think you could have more flexibility at the end of the time of the EULA process by giving the City Planning Commission time to extend it, and that would make it a better planning tool at the beginning. I would have a citywide review panel to which you could review complaints. I would take a hard look at secondary displacement. I would also look at how public assets are evaluated. Parks should not just be looked at in terms of the number of people per square acre. They're more organic and they're more important than that, and that has to be analyzed again. And those are some of the things I would do right from the beginning. And I would build in commitments in the approval process through restrictive text.
I mean, I would, to that last point, I think accountability. I think that having a useful tools to ensure that that those mitigations that are laid out and agreed to can, are actually achieved in a timely fashion, and it kind of goes, justice delayed is justice denied, right? I mean, at what point? I look at the situation in Williamsburg Greenpoint where there's now, 10, 12 years later, it's almost a generation that didn't have access to those open spaces, so I think a level of clawback or accountability, however we approach it, should be a kind of a thing that we're all collectively looking at.
All those things. Plus, I think, an annual disclosure report. I also think, it's important to this has been my refrain the whole time, to bring communities into the process. But I mean, specific to seeker, I think we need to bring communities into defining what should be examined in an environmental impact statement. I think, just blithely telling a community that, like, displacement is significant only if it affects 500 or more people. I mean, that shouldn't be up to the city to decide. I mean, I think that should be up to a community to decide. So, I think we need a space to have a conversation about what a community would like to see examined in terms of impacts.
And when does that come in? I mean, because you have these different stages.
Yeah.
Where is it?
Scoping.
It comes in scoping?
Scoping.
Yep, scoping. And that goes back to my statement about how much of the deal is locked down pre-scoping, and that communities need to really be involved much earlier in the conversation.
That was going to be my point, more earlier involvement by the community. There's, in development you have pre-design phase, and in pre-design, that's where the framework is laid. And so how can you create a niche for the public to be involved in the after the city decides that we're going to rezone this area and the pre-discussions are happening. And I know the city agencies have to do their work, but there needs to be a way where there's community input early before the scoping document. That's what I think.
Okay, we are just about out of time, so I want to thank the panelists. Thank you for your fabulous questions. And I think this is a really good conversation.
Thank you. You did a great job.